Thank you to my channel members and Ko-fi supporters that make these videos possible. You can also support me by buying a deck tech on my weekly Tuesday and Sunday streams. More info in the video description. Hello everyone. I don't know about you all, but I keep an unmodified precon with all my other commander decks just in case I need to play some precon level magic. I've had the same deck on me since its release a few years ago. Personally, I find it hilarious in the areas where it falls short while still having some powerful lines. But I didn't just want to spend a video talking about my favorite precon, so I figured I'd make a video delving into precons as a whole, both old and new, to better set the stage for what I like about it and what irks me about it. Where better to start than by giving a brief analysis of the first 5 commander precons printed in 2010, since, well, they were the first. They focused on the color wedges, since 3 color options for the command zone were quite limited at the time. The face commanders are all EDH icons, still within the top 500 of the EDH rec database today. And the backup commanders also contain some incredibly interesting designs, mostly. The decks also included 5 enemy color commanders, of which Edric and Skullbriar still see frequent play, though Bassandra was a fan favorite for reasons. Besides new commanders, the precons also offered 36 other new cards. Scavenging Ooze, Hornet Queen, Flusterstorm, Sewer Nemesis, Stranglehold, Chaos Warp, Homeward Path, and Champion's Helm all stand out as eternal commander designs, with some even making it into standard legal sets. Who can, of course, forget Command Tower as well, which in this set made multicolor mana bases that much more accessible, eventually. As for a while, it was a card exclusive to these precons, demanding a price of over $6 for about over a year. Not all the new designs were quite as liked either, such as the dud cycle of cards with the joined forces mechanic, even though I am partial to the dragon. These decks were also particularly poorly constructed, even for precons. Going through each one, the Kaalia precon was rocking low-impact cards, Orzhov Guildmage, Razorjaw Oni, and Dragon Whelp. Quite egregiously, though, the precon also included Lightkeeper of Emeria, Dread Cacodemon, and Reaver Demon, all of which you'd need to cast in order to get their benefit, something that Kaalia's play pattern doesn't lend itself well to. Now, you might be able to excuse the demons as a design choice to create a decision for the player of big body now or big effect later, but also included is the Join Forces Dragon, which has an attack trigger, something that can lead to a lot of confusion with Kaalia, since she puts it in tapped and attacking, which seems like it could work if you're new to the game, but it doesn't. Riku's precon infamously included Ruination. Yeah, welcome to the format, guys. Also, combined with the insanely high curve and low number of ramp spells, the deck felt way too slow. Gave's precon, at first glance, looks like the best of them, until you realize what a headache it would be to play up against the attrition in the tokens deck. In addition, the absurdly high-costed Chorus of the Conclave and Celestial Force feel out of place. The Mimeoplasm is weird, because it definitely has a lot going for it. Buried Alive, Windfall, Sewer Nemesis, all cards that go incredibly well with him. But it also included some oddball cards like Spell Crumple. Why would you want to put a creature spell on the bottom when the Mimeoplasm benefits from them going to the graveyard? Maybe for the similarly out-of-place Living Death? This deck contains a lot of cards that can only mill opponents, which is not something you want to do into a Living Death. The final deck is Zedru, no doubt the weakest commander of the 4, yet her 99 still contains a card that would later be banned from Commander, Trade Secrets. It also boasted an abysmally low 34 lands, whereas the other decks had a far more responsible 39 or more. Despite having individual good card designs, yes, I am a Kaalia apologist, the decks were very disjointed and had a lot of non-bows or annoying play patterns to them that would not be a good introduction to the format. Nowadays, precons are quite different and definitely better as a whole generally, but some issues still remain. To illustrate what I mean, one needs to only look at a recent precon. When I asked my Discord what their favorite precon was, once you ignored the throng of people that just found Lord Windgrace hot, Henzi was a forerunner. Let's look at his deck to see how things evolved over time. Starting with the good. The curve is pretty great with a healthy amount of ramp, about 12 pieces to support it. The game plan is pretty strong as well. With the blitz mechanic, you're pretty rewarded for sending your creatures forward into combat without fear, And the creatures the deck packs are pretty huge. Garruk's Uprising, Stalking Vengeance, and Warstorm Surge helps push damage through gummed up boards as well. Overall, this deck supports a way more cohesive game plan than attacking with Kaalia and putting a Lightkeeper of Emeria into play. I also like a lot of the cards included to play with the Blitz mechanic. Industrial Advancement, Evolutionary Leap, Teamer Sabertooth, Disciple of Bolas, and First Responder all have cool lines that would make a new player far more engaged than having their lands blown up by a Ruination or being locked under an attrition. That being said, the Precon still has its flaws. The first real one, I'll admit, is rather small, but still hilariously confusing. That being the inclusion of Overgrown Battlement and Reign of Riches. The deck only has a grand total of 2 cards with Defender in it, including the Battlement. When I mentioned this to my Discord, people literally couldn't believe it. They asked me whose deck I was looking at, not realizing this was an official list from Wizards of the Coast. Of course, an option like Sylvan Caryatid would be perfect in this slot for a 3-color dork that still blocks. But even if we wanted to keep ourselves to the WotC Precon construction rules and keep this slot in uncommon, Paradise Druid is unarguably better here. And I don't think it should be argued that this is a 2-mana Llanowar Elves that's an 0/4 that you can block with. The cost of it being this misleading doesn't justify that as a payoff. As for the Reign of Riches, the deck only contains a whopping 2 other cards that care about or make treasure, that being Jolene the Plunder Queen and Glittering Stockpile. Meaning most games, the 2 treasures you get from Reign of Riches will be all that you see, once again making this card misleading. Secondly, although the deck has an equal spread of colors in its mana base, it should be heavier in green than it is. Admittedly pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, but it will certainly come up when you have triple green pips across cards in your hand that you want to cast with Kenzie's cost reduction. I have yet to dive into it yet, but let me get into the topic here of the misnomered backup commander. In Henzie, the Beamtown Bullies is not a good backup commander for the deck. It would flounder quite hard if all you did was swap the commanders. Looking back at the first Precons as well, none of the commanders could do a good job leading the decks they were in either, besides maybe Animar. Some people might think that this is a flaw, but it seems rather intentional that the backup commander of most, if not all decks today, aren't meant to actually be a backup as the nickname implies. They instead offer an alternative build path for the deck's archetype. The Winter Cynical Opportunist Precon focused on Delirium, which likes dual-typed cards. So they included Redmaw in the 99 as, hey look, you can also do the archetype this way, despite the deck only having 16 dual-typed cards. There's a second flaw on the surface here with Precons that in fact is actually pretty intentional, and that is inclusions of below-rate cards. Looking at the Henzie Precon, I didn't list World Shaper, Bellowing Mauler, Indrik Stomp Howler, or even Aether Snap as mistakes, purely because, even though I wouldn't put these in a Henzie deck if I were to build one, it gives easy cuts to a newer player who wants to make swaps. What makes these below-rate cards separate from the previously mentioned mistakes of Overgrown Battlement and Reign of Riches is that these two hint at synergies and play patterns that the deck doesn't even try to commit to, misleading players, while the rest are at least kind of related to the deck's mechanics, despite being subpar. So then, all of this has been leading up to the grand reveal of my favorite Precon, the one that best displays, in my opinion, the hilarious low lows and the impactful high highs that Precon Magic can give you. Necron Dynasties. For starters, I've had multiple people aghast when I mentioned this as my Precon of choice. That's a mean Precon to have. Isn't that like the best one ever? Let me tell you, the deck is not that good. It has explosive lines for certain, but it's far from a broken deck. Partially because of purposeful design choices, but also because of what I can only assume are true design mistakes. But no negativity for now. Let's talk about what I truly love about this deck. Firstly, I love the aesthetics. In past videos, I've said I hate the Universes Beyond border, but I only hate it when it meshes with the normal Magic borders. When an entire deck shares it, I'm cool with it. And Warhammer being science fantasy, where's the brush metal look the best? All of the art in this list feels cohesive, since it's all made specifically for this deck, which can be said for few other Precons. The fact that it's the only monocolored deck among any of the other Universes Beyond Precons as well lends itself well to this. I think there's no rival in terms of Precon aesthetics. Necrons take the cake. Secondly, the deck does contain some decently powerful cards and lines. The deck has a ton of artifact ramp, making accelerating into a turn 4 or 5 Necron monolith insanely reasonable. From there, it's not hard to flood the board and mill a Dread return, which can be used to return some devastating bomb like Technomancer to play. The deck's heavy self-mill theme also lends itself well to the Living Death in the list, since it hardly mills opponents, and in fact, it actually can grave hate opponents with Canoptic Scarab Swarm. The deck also sports 2 sweepers in addition to Living Death, making for some consistent control lines. The strongest games by far with the deck land an early Xeric into an Imatech, and then later a Necron Monolith. At this point, sometimes as early as turn 6, you're making upwards of 6 to 8 Necrons a turn, which is absurd tempo. Biotransference is also a sneakily good card, passively generating Necrons whenever you cast a creature or artifact spell, but also turning the Satan, Shard of the Nightbringer, into an artifact creature that can then be returned with Onrakir the Traveler or your commander, making it easier to get its devastating Enter the Battlefield effect, which needs you to cast it to do so. My final thoughts for good cards in the deck are on Out of the Tombs, which is a powerful self-mill engine. Although rare, this card can just win the game by itself if you happen to get your library empty. Not a lot of people seem to know this, but the Necron Precon has 2 infinite combos. Both combos start the same, with you returning Triarch Praetorian to draw 2 cards, which instead lets you return 2 more creatures. Option A is you return Canoptic Spider and Necron Deathmark, milling an opponent for 3 and having it kill itself, then drawing off the spider to repeat that loop. Alternatively, you can return Psychomancer and Trazyn for infinite drain, since you can sacrifice Trazyn to Commander Sphere to draw a card, which immediately brings him back from the graveyard. Anyway, that's a lot. It's time to talk about what Necrons get wrong. Firstly is the commander itself, Xeric the Silent King. Xeric here is lackluster. Milling 3 often causes you to miss, since the deck only contains a grand total of 30 artifact creatures and vehicles. Even with the generous assumption that you draw only 2 artifact creatures or vehicles by turn 5, the turn that Xeric is most likely to attack on, you still will have a 30% chance of whiffing on the mill that Xeric gives. This being said, I don't think Imatech should lead the Precon as it stands, nor should any other Necron legend here. There are, by my count, only 19 cards that trigger Imatech in the deck, and that's including some exorbitantly expensive unearth costs. The next major issue of the Necron Precon is its curve. It is highly concentrated on 4 drops, and yet it only runs 4 cards that can ramp it from turn 2 to 4. That 4 drop density also conflicts heavily with the cost of the commander. Not every commander wants to be turboed out there on curve, but an advantage engine that has to attack to get value like Xeric is one of those cards that indeed wants this treatment. So then by that notion, why is the deck obsessed with ramping on turn 3 and 4? Canoptic Wraith, Myriad Landscape, Commander Sphere, which I'll forgive because of the funny Trazyn Infinite, Unstable Obelisk, Hedron Archive, Scepter of Eternal Glory, all cards that don't help you play Xeric on curve like his design suggests he wants to be. I've already described this deck's strongest line, that being the synergy between Xeric, Necron, Monolith, and Imatech, which I like to call the token half of the deck. But that's far from the only part of this deck, as it has another package, the unearthed side of the deck. And I promise you this half of the deck is ass. There are 8 cards in the deck with unearthed, and yet Convergence of Dominion is in the deck? You're gonna need it too, because the average unearthed cost in this deck is nearly 6 mana. The package's only saving grace is Ghost Arc, which I consider just an individually good card in and of itself. The last major thing about the Necron's Precon that makes it so incredibly janky is some of the downright hilariously bad designs you can find in here. I think this Precon has some of the most laughable cards ever in Precon history. Firstly is Trazyn. Yes, he's a good card. Yes, he can participate in a combo if you milled yourself out. Here, though, he is so out of place. Most games, this metal freak is going to have like crew 4 or something. And sometimes, rarely, he might tap for 3 mana off Gilded Lotus or something. Just an utter anomaly here. And that's nothing compared to the colossal disappointment that is Tombblade. Holy hell, this card reeks. It's a 6 mana 5/4 flyer, so you're already below rate, even when you can unearth it for 8 mana. So surely it has a good ability. Nope. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses life equal to the number of creatures they control, unless they sacrifice a creature. So let me get this straight. This card that punishes people for having a wide board is countered by people having a wide board? I have never, ever, ever wanted to see a design process for a card at Wizards so bad other than this one. There's similarly baffling creatures like Plasmancer, a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that tutors Swamp on entry, or Lichguard and Necron Overlord that are far too expensive to practically do anything outside of turn 10 billion. But these are forgivable as cards that have some play despite being weak, compared to the garbage that is Tombblade. It would just feel nitpicky to say that these are design mistakes. I've given quite a few examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly of precons over the course of history here. So let me give some thought as to the current era of precon design. I like the precon of today as a jumping off point. And I like that they include intentionally bad cards if they complement the deck's game plan and don't mislead the player or literally non-bow with themselves. I feel like there's a stark contrast between a card that is fine but replaceable and an utter brick that does next to nothing. I do hope that precon design gets slightly tighter in future to offer more focused gameplay without having any more overgrown battlements or Tombblades that make me question my sanity, while still having room for the deck to grow. Tell me, what is your favorite precon? Did this video help you see some of the inner workings of precon design? Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, bye! Of course, an option like Sylvan Scariated. Ooh! Ooh, boo! Sylvan Scariated. And glittering stockpile.